The international situation is a particularly strange and confusing one today. I think if we go back a decade to the period which was dominated by the Bush administration's drive, the wars, or rather the initial wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the picture seemed very clear. There was a US imperialism waving a big stick, using its military power, and everything else was shaped by and subordinated to that. That's not, I'm going to argue, the picture that we're confronted today. Of course, US imperialism is tremendously important, but the picture is much messier. One indication of how messy it is that, of course, after Bush came Barack Obama, and Barack Obama made a very strong case for being the president that was going to end those wars that I was talking about and to withdraw US troops, first from Iraq and then from Afghanistan. When he stood for re-election, that's one of the things he really emphasized. If we look at the situation today, actually we see that something's changed as far as that's concerned. First of all, Obama halted the rundown of US troops in Afghanistan. Secondly, the US is actually returning troops to Iraq, not on a huge scale, not the tens of thousands of heavily armoured troops that invaded Iraq in 2003, but nevertheless there are several thousand US special forces primarily who are actively involved in trying, rather ineffectually, to prop up the Iraqi government against the offensive of ISIS. And one asks, why is this changed? Why has Obama moved away from what seemed to be his trademark policy of getting US boots off the ground in the what's sometimes called the Greater Middle East? Now, there's a very easy explanation which a lot of people on the left would put, which is to say, well, this is an imperialist system under which we live. Imperialism is US power, and what we see is a constant process of the expansion of US power. So, of course, the US wants to send more troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, and as part of the same pattern of explanation, lots of people on the left see the war that burst out in Ukraine something over a year ago, and which is partly over, partly carrying on in a low-intensity way at the present time, as essentially a war of US expansion, dragging Ukraine into the US sphere of influence. Now, I think the real picture is very different from that. And one reason why so many people on the left don't really recognize the real picture is that they start with an understanding of imperialism which is very different from the classical Marxist theory of imperialism. The theory developed by people like Lenin and Luxemburg 100 years ago at the time of the First World War. The problem that they were trying to address wasn't that of why the world is dominated by a single power. That wasn't the world that they saw themselves confronted. Rather, they were confronted by a world in which the dominant reality was one of what Marxists have tended to call inter-imperialist rivalry. The clash of great economic and military powers competing with each other to dominate the world and its resources. Britain, Germany, the United States, France, Japan, and so on and so forth. And what they sought to do was to show that these rivalries had to be understood as the consequence of a specific phase of capitalist development. These rivalries didn't represent an autonomous political process. They didn't represent just a sort of abstract drive to power, the Kaiser, Wilhelm I, and God knows who else, the other leaders of the great powers simply wanting more and more power. No, those rivalries had to be understood within the framework of an understanding of how capitalism had developed to the point at which it had at the beginning of the 20th century. This is summed up by Lenin's pamphlet, which he originally entitled Imperialism, the Latest Phase of Capitalist Development. After his death, it was changed to the higher stage of capitalism. But originally, it was Imperialism, the latest stage of capitalist development. In other words, to adapt the phrase of a famous German Marxist philosopher who said you can't understand fascism without talking about capitalism, you can't understand imperialism without talking about capitalism. Now, just to elaborate on these theoretical underpinnings a bit, I would say, and this is my own take, rather than that tries to build on Lenin and Luxemburg and so on and so forth. So don't take it as gospel truth. It may be very dodgy, but in my view, imperialism represents, or modern capitalist imperialism, because of course historically there have been other forms of imperialism, but I don't have time to talk about that. Modern capitalist imperialism represents the intersection of economic and geopolitical competition. Imperialism is what happens when economic and geopolitical competition fuse. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, economic competition is the competition among capitalist firms, the basic units of the system, which is one of the driving forces of capitalism, and that drives in particular the process of capital accumulation. Geopolitical competition are the different kinds of rivalries among states. Now, those rivalries have been going on wherever we've had states. They've been going on where you have state societies, i.e., as Engels shows, class societies, for the past few thousand years. Empires have been built and have clashed with each other. You had the great struggles among the Greek city-states 2,000 or more years ago, and so more than 2,500 years ago, and so on and so forth. So geopolitical competition is nothing new. But what happens at the beginning of the 20th century is that geopolitical competition is merged and integrated into the rivalry among capitals. And for a very simple reason, which is as I said, Marx argues that competition drives the accumulation of capital. And the accumulation of capital is capitalist firms reinvesting some of their profits in expanding production and reducing their costs. And this leads to the growth of the system and the growth of the economies that are organised along capitalist lines. But Marx also argued that the concentration and centralisation... Sorry, put it wrong. I got to the answer before I got to the end of the sentence before I'd got to the start. The accumulation of capital produces what he calls the concentration and centralisation of capital. What does that mean? As a result of competition, the size of individual firms grows, but also the big and efficient firms tend to swallow up the smaller and weaker firms. So increasingly, capitalism is dominated by a small number of large firms. And what happens increasingly, from the late 19th century onwards, is that defending those firms' interests becomes bound up with the assertion of power of the individual states where they base themselves. So that firms increasingly operating on a global basis in trade and investment and so on need the support of their state. Equally, the states themselves come to depend upon capital for their own success. To be a geopolitically successful state, by the late 19th century onwards, you needed an industrial capitalist base. You needed the kind of weapon systems, the transport infrastructure, the trains, the artillery, the high-velocity rifles, and so on and so forth, that modern industrial capitalism produces. And it's this interweaving between the state and capital that produces the intersection of economic and geopolitical competition that characterizes modern capitalist imperialism. So the bottom line to all this is that imperialism isn't primarily about one big power dominating, bullying everything else, everyone else. Imperialism is a system of intercapitalist competition. It's the development of intercapitalist competition onto the political and geopolitical terrain. So competition is a key dimension of imperialism. This was obvious in the first half of the 20th century because that's dominated essentially by the struggle over who would supplant Britain as the dominant capitalist power. Britain had been the dominant capitalist power of the 20th century, the base of the Industrial Revolution, the city, the centre of the global financial system, etc., etc. By the beginning of the 20th century, it's declining. Who is going to replace it? Is it going to be Germany or is it going to be the United States? We know the answer to the question. The United States became dominant by the end of the Second World War. Then we have, but after that, the characteristic of imperialism as a system of competition is masked by the form that competition takes. Because first of all, it takes the form of the Cold War. In other words, you have this huge geopolitical struggle that doesn't lead to outright war between the superpowers themselves, between the US on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other, each with their tributaries and client regimes supporting them and so on and so forth. But of course, for much of the left, the Soviet Union wasn't part of the capitalist system. The Soviet Union was a workers' state or socialist or post-capitalist, whatever you wanted to call it, but it wasn't capitalist. And therefore, it looked as if this geopolitical struggle had gone beyond capitalist imperialism. We in the Socialist Workers' Party never believed that. We thought the Soviet Union was a specific form of capitalism, state capitalism, and we argued that the Soviet Union operated as an imperialist power, so that the Cold War for us was a particular form of imperialist competition. But in any case, for much of the left, they got out of the habit of applying the original insights of Luxemburg and Lenin and so on, to looking at the contemporary world. The problem increasingly became just American power. The imperialism became a shorthand way of referring to the United States. This is reinforced by the so-called unipolar moment. The end of the Cold War, Soviet Union disintegrates, its whole empire disintegrates and are integrated into the Western liberal capitalist bloc, and as a result of that, the US seems all-powerful. This is what one American neoconservative called the unipolar moment. There's one pole to the... In the days of the Cold War, we had a bipolar international system. On the one hand, the US, on the other hand, of the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union goes, we just have the United States. We have a unipolar world. And you have this wave of American triumphalism that is associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the US's apparent enormous advantage. But if we move, the unipolar moment was more than 20 years ago. If we fast forward to today, the picture seems very different. Don't get me wrong, Barack Obama is an extremely dedicated servant of American imperialism. And he's working hard to maintain the hegemony of the United States. But it's unquestionable that the relative power of the United States is in decline, and that this is creating all sorts of new forms of instability. So let me look at some of the things that are weakening US imperialism. First of all, the US was defeated in Iraq. Now, it may seem stupid that I have to say that, but you can read lots of stuff on the left which says, no, the US wasn't defeated in Iraq. Even someone as splendid in many ways as Naomi Klein wrote a book trying to prove that the US hadn't lost in Iraq because companies like Blackwater made a lot of money out of the occupation. Sorry, that doesn't wash. The US sought to conquer Iraq to entrench its domination of the Middle East and therefore to force all the other powers to recognize that it ultimately controlled their access to the most important reserves of oil in the world. Instead of demonstrating that, the US ended up fighting a desperate counterinsurgency war, at the end of which, it was able to stabilize the situation, but it ended up handing over control of the country to a sectarian Shiite government very closely aligned to Iran. That was a major geopolitical defeat. It was a worse defeat than Vietnam, because in Vietnam, the US lost in Indochina, but Indochina didn't count that much economically. What counted much more were Japan and increasingly South Korea, Taiwan, and so on and so forth. And what you see after defeat in Vietnam is the increasing flourishing of a nexus of states in East Asia, growing rapidly, becoming more and more important economically, all of which are strongly tied geopolitically to the United States. So, famously, President Eisenhower said, if we don't win in Vietnam, the dominoes will fall and we'll lose control of the whole of Asia. In the case of Vietnam, the dominoes held up. If we look to the case of the Middle East, it doesn't look so good from that point of view, because following on from the defeat in Iraq came the revolutions in the Arab world, which have had huge destabilizing consequences. And as a result both of the Iraqi disaster and the counter-revolutionary reaction to the revolutions, we've had the rise to ISIS. And I know there are conspiracy theorists who say, really, ISIS is working in the interests of the US. I'm sorry. This is fantasy. ISIS is the symbol of US defeat in Iraq and its consequences. Secondly, the second factor weakening the US is, of course, the economic crisis, which starts in the US and which had the most damaging consequences, first on the US and secondly on the European Union. And it's important to emphasize the difficulties that the Eurozone crisis has posed for the United States. When Bush invaded Iraq, remember he invaded it against the opposition of France and Germany. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is a slightly crazy but very clever American geopolitical strategist associated primarily with the Democrats, said, I don't really mind whether you invade Iraq, but it is completely idiotic to invade Iraq without the support of the European Union. The European Union is an essential junior partner for the United States. If the US operates independently of the European Union, it's still the biggest power, but it has much less resources than it has when it acts with the European Union, so long as the US can ensure that the European Union, follows along loyally behind the US, which on the whole it tends to do. So that the fact that the Eurozone has imploded, the fact that the European political elite have turned completely in on themselves at the minute like a gang of school bullies trying to beat up on the Greeks and so on, is a very damaging problem for the United States. The third and most fundamental reason for US decline is for the weakening of US power is US relative economic decline. The US share of the world economy is still pretty big, still over 20%, particularly if you don't use the kind of dubious calculations that are used by institutions like the World Bank, who want to big up development in the global south to make their own policies seem better than they actually are. The US still controls more than a fifth of the world economy, but its share is shrinking. And of course, the obverse of that is the rise of China. China is now the world's biggest exporter, the world's biggest producer of manufacturing goods, the world's biggest importer of oil. What goes with that? The world's biggest producer of CO2 emissions and so on. So that And it's not true. So it's not true that China is a new superpower that is comparable in power to the United States. But China is a very dynamic economy, very rapidly growing, or has been until very recently, in a way that was only true for quite short periods of time. In the case of the Soviet Union, there was a panic in the 1950s when the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik, when people started saying maybe the Soviet Union is catching up with the US. That was an illusion even then. The Soviet Union was never a serious economic challenger to the US. China is a serious economic challenger. Also, it is quite outside the whole nexus of alliances that the US has built since the Second World War. Because one of the significant things about American power is that it hasn't simply, of course, if you look at American power, we can talk about the Pentagon, we can talk about the network of US military bases around the world, we can talk about the dollar, US multinational corporations and so on. But also very, very important for the US is the whole nexus of alliances that it presides over. NATO, for example, extremely important historically from the point of the United States. To some extent, the European Union is another, although the US isn't formally a member of the European Union, nevertheless, the formation of the European Union was strongly promoted by the United States, and the expansion of the EU into Eastern and Central Europe in the 2000s, essentially, particularly because it was part of a package deal that extended NATO as well into those areas, greatly expanded the power of the United States into the Eurasian continent. So the US has always operated through a network of alliances. That is an advantage in dealing with China because it can try and mobilize those different alliances. But nevertheless, China is an outsider. And China isn't just growing economically, it's building up its military power. It's expanding defense spending very fast. It's in particular building up its navy. Or rather, as one commentator put it, it's developing an anti-navy. In other words, it's developing the military capabilities to force the US Navy away from the Pacific coast. Because since the Second World War, the US Navy has controlled the Pacific. As people often say, it's been an American lake. Chinese ruling class say, well, sorry, we don't think the Pacific should be an American lake, and in particular, we don't want the US close to our coast. And they do so not just for matters of national pride, because China's exports and imports are crucially directed towards the rest of the world, apart from the western United States, through the Straits of Malacca. And the Straits of Malacca, someone said in the 15th century, whoever controls the Straits of Malacca has their hand round the throat of Venice, which was then the big capitalist trading power. Today, anyone who controls the Straits of Malacca has their hand round the throat of the Chinese ruling class. And at the minute, the power that could close the Straits of Malacca are the United States. This is why China is, for example, Xi Jinping, the new Chinese president, is talking a lot about a new Silk Road. In other words, routes in particular to Europe and to Africa that would bypass the sea route and therefore make China less dependent on US naval power. But in any case, they're also building the capabilities directly to challenge US naval power. They've developed missiles that can sink aircraft carriers, for example. Who has almost all the world's aircraft carriers? The United States. It's very interesting to see what China is doing at the minute in the South China Sea, where there are very fierce disputes over various islands in those seas, which may give access to big energy reserves in the sea. China is concreting over some of the islands it claims to in order to create airstrips. Now, I don't think those airstrips are there for tourist flights. I don't think there's going to be a huge flow of Chinese people to admire the Spratly Islands. Everyone recognises those are probably for military purposes. So it's not that, don't get me wrong, the Chinese ruling class aren't saying we're going to take on the United States. If they took on the United States, they would lose. We'd all lose. But they would certainly lose. But they are creating the conditions in which they can assert what they see as their rightful power in their own backyard. This is the geopolitical conflict of the 21st century. And it's amazing, people on the left don't talk about it. You get obsessive, minute analyses of what's happening in Ukraine and things like that. Very few people on the left look at what's happening between the US and China. And the Obama administration is responding to these developments by what is called the pivot to Asia. In other words, they're giving priority in their security policy. I'm sorry, I know it's very hot in here. I don't know why. I'll try and finish as quickly as possible. That's all I can do. But the heat makes it hard to finish, actually. The US is giving priority in its diplomacy and its military capabilities to dealing with the challenge from China, the so-called pivot to Asia. This is its number one priority. So when people say Obama is plotting to grab the Ukraine, this is not his priority. His priority is to deal with China. He would love not to have to think about Europe and certainly not about the Middle East. The problem is, and this is one of the difficulties that confronts US imperialism, that it can't afford to do that. The US and the imperialist system generally are confronted with a multiplicity of crises. The first is, of course, the Ukrainian crisis. I mean, I don't want to spend much time on it, but essentially the EU, the EU justifies itself by saying, we've ensured that Europe should be at peace since the Second World War. Well, in the case of Ukraine, the EU, in a blundering and arrogant way, how familiar is that, seeking to draw Ukraine into its sphere of influence, helped to precipitate a war. And there are lots of elements to the war, but one crucial dimension to it is a strong defensive reaction by Russia, because Russia doesn't want Ukraine to fall into the EU-NATO sphere of influence, since Ukraine, apart from being economically quite important, borders directly on Russia. So there, in the case of Ukraine, you have an inter-imperialist conflict. Russia, a much weaker imperialism, but still powerful in the areas around it, not just Ukraine and Belarus and so on and so forth, but also Central Asia, asserting itself against the EU and the US. And once the EU got into a mess, of course, the US had to get involved. This reflects the weakness of the EU as a would-be imperialism. You can't be a successful imperialist power just with trade agreements. And even with the EC using the power of the European Central Bank, you have to have military capabilities. When the EU got into trouble, who steps in? It's the US. Secondly, we have, of course, the Middle East, which is destabilized by the chaos created by the US invasion of Iraq, and also, of course, by the combined effects of the revolutions of 2011 and the counter-revolutions that have sought to crush them. Okay, this produces most visibly the disintegration of first Syria and now Iraq. Here, the US is engaged in a balancing act. It wants to restabilize the situation, but it doesn't want to restore to the Assad regime in Syria its dominance over the the country. That's one constraint. And of course, it doesn't want ISIS to consolidate the kind of power it has. So those are the US's objectives. It also doesn't want boots on the ground. It doesn't want to deploy its own troops in order to try and stabilize the situation there. The numbers it's sending there are quite selective and small numbers of troops. So what it's pursuing instead is a policy of building coalitions that together will restabilize the situation. This is part of a larger US strategy, incidentally. Part of how the US is responding to China is by encouraging powers like Japan and India and even Vietnam, the old enemy, to cooperate with Washington in containing Chinese power. So a policy of developing coalitions at key crisis points is a crucial dimension of the US policy. The difficulty in the case of the Middle East is that the candidates to be the US allies in the region have very strongly conflicting interests. If you run a list of those powers, they're Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel. Now, you just have to name those states to produce a whole series of conflicts and so on. And in a way, the most dangerous of these allies is Saudi Arabia, because the Saudi ruling class, who are particularly rotten and corrupt gang, but who legitimize their power through their control of the Muslim holy places, and who defend a very traditionalist interpretation of Sunni Islam, see as their great enemy Iran, which isn't just a geopolitical problem, but also is an ideological rival because, well, the name of Iran, the Iranian state, the Islamic Republic of Iran, gives it away. They too claimed to defend the right interpretation of the Islam. So the Saudis are absolutely paranoid about Iran and the expansion of its power, its allies in Syria and Lebanon and so Iraq and so on and so forth. They're paranoid about Iran. Obama is trying to draw closer to Iran by trying to resolve a deal over Iran's nuclear program. This drives the Saudis even more mad, and so they're beginning to take initiatives which are potentially very destabilizing, like the brutal and ham-fisted intervention in Yemen that took place a few months ago. So the Middle East, which is strategically crucial because of the oil there and the way in which dominating the region allows the US to regulate the access of other powers to that oil, is becoming more unstable and harder to control. And the kind of only solution that the US has, which is divide and rule and building coalitions and playing different powers off against each other, carries the risk of further destabilization. Okay, I'll leave it there. I just want to say in conclusion, what this analysis shows is, I think, four things. Understanding imperialism as a system of competition, not simply as the dominance of a particular power. The importance of not getting drawn behind our own ruling class's response to the chaos that we can see, particularly in the Middle East, which is to build up Islamophobia, because we can see from what happened over Charlie Hebdo and, for example, the recent atrocity in Tunisia, but what we're caught in, what the ruling class's strategy catches us in, is a vicious cycle of atrocity, intervention, radicalization, and further atrocity, which carries the danger of dragging us all down. So we have to reject in any way supporting that kind of approach. Thirdly, we have to refuse the temptation of campism. In other words, refuse to think that the rivals to the biggest imperialist power are somehow more progressive than it, that China and Russia are in some sense qualitatively better than the United States. That's not true. The main difference between them and the United States is that they're weaker than it. But finally, if the problem is the system, then of course we have to oppose the military powers campaigns of our masters, of our rulers, but more important than that is to build up the collective strength in the working class and in the socialist movement that can put an end to that system altogether.
I was hoping not to be the first speaker, but I thought I'd get it out of the way and then enjoy the rest of the discussion. Okay, I spend a lot of my time talking to people with opposite or oppositional views to mine because I learn a lot from that technique. I was speaking to a realist friend recently because I posed him a question which was, of all the three spots in the world that could just like be the fuse that sets up the... Would it be Ukraine? Would it be Greece? Or would it be Southeast Asia or the South China Seas? And he said to me, it's definitely... it's more likely to be the Greek question. Now, this is the question I want to pose to Alex Callinicos, which is this. I really appreciate very much his combination of the realist, which is from above, because he did say that if you're going to talk about imperialism and the interstate rivalry, you really have to deal with the realist question. And then as our organization and our tradition and so on, we come from below upwards. And we argue that change must come from below. And opposing this, it would be, we have to deal with a lot of attacks from the big guns, the capitalists, the capitalist system, and of course the big states themselves, being what Alex just said, America, China, and Russia at the moment. So I was just wondering, the scenario, is it a possible scenario at all that the Greek question would cause a contagion? That means that there's going to be a lot, because I feel it now, a lot of solidarity, the working class, and so on and so forth. And I was wondering, would that be enough to spark the US to come into some kind of confrontation with Russia in the Mediterranean, and so on and so forth? Now, this is just speculative. It could be just far, and we're hoping that it could be just like, still solvable as a problem.
Thanks. The woman there, and the guy.
I want to thank Alex for the clarity on this, because I think it's really important that we do see imperialism as a set of economic and geopolitical rivalries. Otherwise, we can very easily fall into the trap of the arguments that poor old Ukraine is just looking for democracy and the big Russians are out to get them, or the worst one, which is that what's going on in the world at the moment is a clash of civilizations between, the backward Islamists and the good Christians. But there is a question, really, is why I came up to ask Alex, was about where does he see TTIPs fitting into this, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership between the EU and America, because this very secretive and cloaked deal, which is being driven through at the moment, will have huge implications for the economic future, I believe, of, in particular, countries and the peripheral countries, in particular, in the EU, and the privatisation of services and the public sector. And I'd like if he could give a bit of an explanation how that fits in, indeed, with the struggle in Europe at the moment against austerity.
Yeah, continuing with the tradition of asking questions, I've got a number of questions. You quite rightly pointed out, I think, that in terms of Russia and China, that they're no way seen as international rivals to America at a global level. But that, for me, begs the question, so is it right to say that Russia and China could be seen as regional superpowers, particularly as far as Russia is concerned in Europe, and we've seen, you've referred quite rightly to Ukraine, and China, again, you've referred to China and the South China Seas and what they're trying to do in terms of building up their anti-navy, as you called it. Linked to that, in terms of China, is it right that China is seeking to expand its economic influence with Africa? And if so, how should we as Marxists respond to that?
Well, a couple of questions, really. It's all questions, isn't it? No one's got any answers. But, I mean, what are we witnessing? I mean, when the Iranian Revolution took place, obviously there was a break with the United States because Iran was a big ally of the US, the Shah of Iran and the rest of it. And then the alliance between the US and Saudis strengthened against that. And also the alliance between Iraq and the US strengthened, but we've seen what happened there. But are we witnessing, because if these talks with the US and Iran are successful, what it will mean is sanctions will be lifted, Iran will grow economically and militarily more because they'll, be in a position to grow better. So are we witnessing, and Americans must be aware of that, are we witnessing the dumping of, if you like, of the Saudis, and the Saudis acting independently in Yemen, etc., trying to establish their role against that of Iran? Also, what was the other one? What was the other one? It was about China. Christ, I'll better leave that one.
Yeah, I've got a slight different take on this. Me personally, I think that this new American policy in the Middle East and in the world is based on a world of nations, in a sense, the family of nations. It's about the free movement of capital. Now, if you want the free movement of capital, capital's got to go into every area of the world. And that, you can't force yourself in there no more. China is a power. Its power is based on its economic power. America's the biggest power in the world. It's based on its economic power. So what it's looking for to deal, because it wants its capital. It wants the free movement of capital. Now, you can't, the days have gone in when you can blunder yourself into a nation and say, take this. It's over. It's now, capitalism, China, capitalism, it's capitalism. Companies about movement. It's all about the movement of profit, making capital. It's not really, for me, about sort of us and them no more. If China opens up, American companies are going to go in there, or they're in there now. So I think we're looking at this about, like Saudi Arabia's got no power. The force behind Saudi Arabia is American arms. They don't make nothing. So I think we've got to be looking at what America's actually looking for now is the nation, the family of nations. The family of nation states where capital can move freely around and capitalists can make big, big bucks.
I mean, what I really take from Alex's talk, other than, at one level you can just sort of speculate which way things are going to go. And isn't it all very interesting? And you might get a good John le Carre novel out of it, set down in the Black Sea or in Southeast China. But I think what we need to take from what Alex is saying is that from the point of view of people struggling against a rotten, unjust system, the people we're up against are badly divided, are racked with crisis, and that the big powers that had set out the idea, particularly the United States, that really all the big conflicts were over, that history had ended, that they had won, and that anybody who was trying to challenge the neoliberal order dominated by the United States and the Western powers was wasting their time. What in fact has happened is the very opposite of what Fukuyama and all these people predicted. At the very moment of their apparent triumph, what you actually see is they're in decline, and that the crisis that tore the former Soviet Union apart is also infecting and developing and deepening, if you like, within the Western bloc. So their ability to control what's going on around the world, the control of any of these powers to control what's going on around the world is, less than comprehensive. That it's very, very prone to crises, that we are going to see, wherever we may see setbacks in Greece or wherever it might be, in the horrors of what we're seeing in Syria or the counter-revolution in Egypt, on the other side of it, they are not capable of stabilizing it. That the system is in deep crisis. The big powers are very divided among one another, and that creates a space for our side. That it means resistance will well up, and it is not the narrative of the all-powerful superpower that can just crush any resistance has to be challenged. And I think that really is what I take from what Alex says. It's a dangerous, it's an unstable situation, but it's also a situation where we can say to people, this is a system that doesn't work. It's dysfunctional. It's racked with war. It's capable of absolutely wrecking places like Iraq and Syria, and we desperately need an alternative to it. So I think that's what I would draw out from it, and that we have to point to that. This is a system that is failing at every level.
David from the IS group in Austria. I want to raise a question concerning Cuba. Because the US recently lifted the trade restrictions on Cuba. And the same people that always tell us, on the left, the same people that US imperialism is an expansion all over the world, now celebrate this kind of lifting of the restrictions as a kind of success of socialism over capitalism. I mean, it's obviously bullshit. But how can we grasp this move of the Obama administration?
A small aside to Alex's introduction when he laid out the sort of history of imperialism, if you like. This year's the 50th anniversary of Singapore, which is a pure expression, really, of that coming together of economic competition and geopolitical rivalry. A city founded by the East India Company, taken over by the British Empire, and all for control of the Straits of Malacca that Alex talked about. But the more fundamental thing I wanted to say was that the comrade who talked about a family of states. It's a family, but it's a warring family, and that's the point about the states. Lenin talked about a band of warring brothers, and that's precisely what they are. And one of the results of the relative decline of US imperialism is the rise in diversity and strength of sub-imperialisms. And you see this very strongly when you look at the Middle East now. So the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria has gone on so long, partly because of the intervention of Iran, the Gulf states, Turkey, the border open with so for ISIS to cross, fighters to cross back and forth, and Shia militias and so on. So there's that supported by Iran. There's that element. In Egypt, you saw Qatar support the Morsi presidency and the Muslim Brotherhood, overthrown by Sisi, who has the support of Saudi Arabia and others of the Gulf states. In Libya, you saw the absurdity where at one point Saudi Arabia and the UAE were bombing forces financially supported by Qatar, and you see it even in the fall in the oil price. a major factor in which is the Saudi determination, the biggest producer of oil, the one producer that can control the oil price, a determination of the Saudis to drive a proportion of the US fracking oil fracking industry out of business so that they can maintain their markets in China and elsewhere in the world. And this is all part of the reason why the US doesn't have it its own way.
I have to say, Alex, this was a great discussion. I'll be honest with you, it's a brilliant discussion, but I have to say, listen to the various, if you like, goings on around the different parts of the world. It makes my stomach feel like a washing machine spinning. It's like, it makes me like, on the one hand, yes, as Richard said, there's always possibilities for us as Marxists to point out to the struggle, and like back home in Ireland, we still have the ongoing issue of Shannon being used by the American Armed Forces to bring prisoners and weapons through, and 2 of our TDs are potentially facing jail this month because they tried to find evidence for now ex-Justice Minister Alan Shatter. And also we are now part of this. Well, I think our politicians, particularly our current government, have now. Before Alan Shatter left, he made sure he made an agreement with the Nordic and Scandinavian NATO forces that we be on 2-week standby. Now, this is important because we need to I don't think we're a neutral country anymore, the south of Ireland anyway. We need to point out the ugliness of imperialism as you've described. But the question I would like to ask is, what would if Britain leaves the European Union, and along with the TTIP that's now come to almost centre stage, not quite centre stage, what would it have an impact on, what would the exit for Britain in terms of imperialism be? Thank you. Bye-bye.
Alex mentioned the importance of stressing how, the West lost in Iraq. And I just wanted to sort of raise the contradiction, really, of anti-imperialist forces, that on the one hand, we had the huge mobilizations of 2003, which effectively prevented all sorts of other possibilities for our ruling classes of engaging in Syria and so on and so forth. And the shadow of that is extremely long even today. People still remember the huge mobilizations for that. But I'm, for example, on the Irish Anti-War Committee, and to be absolutely honest, mobilizations since then have been very difficult. The issue that really stands out is Palestine, and that is the exception, so that you've got this long shadow from 2003, which is on our side, but actually mobilizing in the current coming together of the different forces today is much more difficult on a more general level, with Palestine being a strong exception, and that will probably continue to be the case. For example, in Ireland now, the whole barometer has moved, like everywhere, but to much more in support of the Palestinian question against against Israel. And so in that, also the other area is the whole question of Islamophobia. And so, although obviously we're all involved in united fronts of anti-imperialism, the importance of actually understanding that the radical left does have the best anti-imperialist message is very clear to us in these united fronts. So that, for example, traditional nationalist parties like Sinn Féin or others, ANC in a different way, no longer stand so clearly against imperialism, but that also the space for the radical left to raise anti-imperialism, often as raising the importance in our own countries against Islamophobia, offers us a way of offering a sharp edge in those united fronts. And I'm just wondering what Alex thinks about that in terms of how we operate in united fronts of anti-imperialism. Thank you.
I'm Thomas. I'm one of the journalists on Socialist Workers. I just wanted to say, when it comes to the crisis in Ukraine, clearly it's an imperialist clash between the West and Russia, but actually it illustrates quite well how imperialism has to be seen as a global system of the, sort of competing capitals and capitalist states. Because one of the reasons that things that happened leading up to the crisis was Russia was trying to create the Eurasian Customs Union almost as some sort of rival to the EU. Now, the reason it wanted to do this, and it needed Ukraine, obviously because Ukraine was sort of one of the second most industrialized sort of state in the former Soviet Empire and so forth, was because it was facing intense competition from China over the Central Asian republics that used to be part of the Soviet Empire. So it saw this as a means of trying to assert its influence in its near abroad there with competition from China. So you can see how this is all locked into competition amongst multiple states, not just one or not just two. Also, I wanted to say, when it comes to some of the arguments that were going on, I think we have to say that clearly there are, the Stalinists and so on and so forth that defend the workers' bomb weirdos outside who sort of put forward that sort of position that Russia, is not an imperialist power. But actually, it's not just them. I think we have to say that many people who have been radicalized through the anti-capitalist movement, through Palestine, and through these sort of challenges, wanting to challenge the system, do see imperialism as being US power because it does conform with their experience. So we have to sort of not approach it in some sort of defensive or sectarian sort of way, because those ideas will come up, but there is a reason that they come up. And also, the other fact is, when it comes to fighting imperialism, we always say that the main enemy is at home, because we say that that's where the working class can strike a blow against their own ruling class as part of a struggle against the imperialist system. But because we've seen such a low level of class struggle during the last 30 years, many people don't look towards the working class as being that agent that can provide that change. So that's another reason why people have fallen into those sort of campus sort of solutions. If you have to oppose the main enemy at home, then perhaps their sort of imperialist enemy is an actual. You should be sort of supporting them. So I think those are the reasons that some of these debates are happening. And I think that we have to sort of build the anti-war movement and say that that role of the anti-war movement is opposition to what our own government is doing. And we can, as socialists, put forward our arguments and our analyses of imperialism, but there shouldn't be preconditions around that when it comes to building the actual movement, because it's incredibly important, not only what's going on abroad, but also it's been mentioned, sort of the wave of Islamophobia that's coming with Prevent and so on and so forth.
One comrade said, I think he was saying, it's a mistake to to put such emphasis on geopolitical conflicts, because really what's happening is all about an undifferentiated capitalist interest in promoting the free movement of capital and so on and so forth. I think it's generally true that all the capitalist classes in the world believe, at least in principle, that their interests lie in open markets and mobility of capital and so on and so forth. But I would say that the way in which they pursue those objectives is mediated by the international structure of the state system, which embodies and sometimes intensifies conflicts between different capitalist classes. And TTIP, which a couple of comrades raised, but also the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because there are two big trade deals that the US is pursuing at the present time. One is TTIP, which is with the EU. The other is in the Pacific, with a number of primarily Asian states. These very much illustrate this, because of course the participants all want, greater liberalisation of the economy. In particular, they want to achieve the things that they hope to through the World Trade Organization, through what was called the Doha Round, that was launched after 9/11 in 2001, but which has run into the ground. Actually, why did it run into the ground? Because of the depth of conflict of interest, particularly between the Western capitalist powers and the so-called emerging market economies like China, India, etc., 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 which illustrates the fact that just because everyone wants greater liberalisation doesn't mean that it happens. because when it comes to specific issues, there are all sorts of conflicts. In the case of TTIP, of course we should oppose it. It would be a reinforcement of neoliberalism. My impression is that this is the EU is more interested in it than the US, because the EU needs to demonstrate that there's some life to it, that it isn't simply this introverted and semi-imploding entity. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is very important to the US, partly for economic reasons, but crucially for geopolitical reasons, because who isn't part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? China. I mean, which seems like an absurdity. How can you have an Asian free trade area that doesn't include China? The answer is because the US is trying to, through the TPP, to create a set of rules governing trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region that it hopes can constrain China. So you can't look at economic liberalisation without looking at geopolitics. Okay, some of the other questions that were raised. The comrade also said that the Saudis don't have any arms. Well, you should tell the Bahrainis or the Yemenis that. You know, the Saudi Air Force is bombing Yemen and killing lots of people at this time. They have quite a big army, actually. Of course, ultimately their survival depends on the support of the US and so on and so forth. But it's a mistake to think that the Saudi ruling class aren't a distinct entity with their own interests and resources, which don't always correspond to those of the US. Ian Taylor is absolutely right. What the Saudis refused to cut output in order to allow the oil price to rise from when it was falling very fast, because they wanted to bankrupt as much as they could of the American fracking industry. Now, that's not particularly good news from the point of the US. So you see, even though the Saudis are very closely allied to the US, there are conflicts between them and the US. Eddie asked, is the US dumping Saudi Arabia? No. The problem, it comes back to what I was saying. The US plays a game of divide and rule everywhere, but particularly in the Middle East. So it pushes the Saudis, it wants to draw the Iranians back into the international community of states on its terms. It's, of course, very closely allied to Israel. Turkey is very important, etc., etc. So it needs all these different states. It's good from its point of view that there are conflicts of interest between these states, because it prevents anyone from becoming dominant or them forming a coalition, particularly to kick the US out of the Middle East, but it makes the whole thing very incoherent. And I'm sorry if that means that there's just a lot of sort of detail about the complexity of the situation, but the complexity illustrates the conflicts in the situation and the constraints on the US. China and Africa. China does invest quite a lot in energy and in construction in Africa, and more broadly in the extraction of raw materials. There's a very good study that's been done by a Chinese-American scholar of Chinese mining interests in Zambia, which is a key copper producer. And what she showed was they didn't operate fundamentally differently from the big Western-owned or Western-aligned mining companies. They treated their workers a bit better than the Western-aligned companies did. I say Western-aligned because one of the companies is Brazilian. So they weren't qualitatively different, as I say, marginally kinder to their workers, but they were very much the subordinate player. The other companies were much more important in defining the terms of the game when it came to copper mining in Zambia. So China is trying to insert itself into international economic networks that have hitherto been dominated by the West, but we shouldn't big up too much China's role. China is still a newcomer. Cuba, I think Obama thought the blockade was an anachronism, that it was worth getting rid of, but also remember the position of Cuba has been weakened because of the implosion of Venezuela. Cuban influence had been increased through the alliance with Venezuela under Chavez. Since Chavez's death, Venezuela has undergone a severe economic and political crisis, which means that there's much less punch behind Cuba than there was a few years ago. So I guess Obama thought this is a relatively advantageous moment to bring the Cubans in. Greece. Is Greece going to spark off a geopolitical conflict between Russia and the US in the Mediterranean? No, absolutely not. I mean, well, or almost certainly not. One has to be careful. I mean, Tsipras has played this game of going to Moscow and all that sort of thing. But I think it's a symbolic game. Apart from anything else, the Russian, the Greek, we know the Greek debt is serious money. Whatever it is, it's what, 350 billion euros. That's about equivalent to Russia's foreign exchange reserves. And they rather need those reserves to deal with their own economic problems. So it's not like Putin's got this huge pocket out of which he can just hand 100 million euros or whatever over to the Greeks. But I think also, if you look, one of the things that is, I think this came up in another meeting, that is, I think, really bad about the Syriza government's policies is the extent to which the government has sought to align itself with the West and with NATO. Most obviously when Tsipras met the butcher Sisi at a meeting in Cyprus. There's supposed to be a further summit that will involve Israel as well in this case. I think much more the Syriza government is trying to say to the Europeans, look, you need us, we're a stabilising force in the East Mediterranean and we're being good boys and girls and so on. And the Americans are saying to the Europeans, come on, idiots, just make a deal and so on, because they don't want the situation destabilised. But Russia isn't in a position to mount a serious channel. It's not going to challenge. It's not going to stick its neck out for Greece. Brexit. It's clear that the serious forces of Western imperialism will be deployed against a no vote in the referendum next year. At the D-Day celebrations last year, Obama said, we want a united Kingdom in the European Union. That's the official message from the White House. And that corresponds to the interests of the American ruling class, of the British ruling class, and of the continental European ruling classes. So if we're talking about in whose interest is it for Britain to stay inside the EU, then it's very clear it's in the interest of the major Western ruling classes. Of itself, I mean, we don't operate a childish politics which says they say yes, so we say no. But nevertheless, if anyone's talking about the relationship between a British exit and imperialist interests, the answer is very, very clear. And that's something that we need to factor into our discussion about exit. Okay, final point, political conclusion. Richard said that the bottom line of what I'm saying is they're not so powerful, they're divided, there's space for us. Yes, but how the issues manifest themselves make a difference. And why the biggest problem I think the anti-war movement is struggling with, it is ISIS. It's they were never able to scare that many people in this country with Saddam Hussein. ISIS, I mean, they're not a creation of Western intelligence, but if Western intelligence wanted to create a fantasy fear object, it would be ISIS. And so that's a real problem that the anti-war movement has to deal with, and it is related to the question of Islamophobia. I've been on some great demonstrations over the last year. Of course, the People's Assembly demonstration against austerity on the 20th of June was a great demonstration. But I think back to the demonstrations this time last year in solidarity with Gaza, and the militancy and dynamism of the demonstrations, and the extent to which you had on those demonstrations very large numbers of Muslim people, and particularly young Muslims, very politically mobilized. One of the weaknesses of the People's Assembly demonstration was I don't think very many of those people were there. Now, we can discuss the reasons for that, but one factor that we have to address is the way in which Islamophobia is being used to divide us, and that is something that we have to fight ferociously and in a principled way wherever we operate around whatever issue.